Welcome back to English Podcast Go. I'm Cyrus, and each episode brings you closer to confident English. Let's jump into today's episode.
Okay, let's unpack this. You know that feeling? That one where you're in a conversation, maybe at work, maybe somewhere else, and things just feel, well, awkward.
Yeah, definitely.
Your stomach tightens, you suddenly feel maybe a bit too warm, and instead of saying what you really need to say, you find yourself just kind of smiling and nodding and saying these really blandly nice things.
That exact thing.
Well, it turns out that seemingly harmless niceness, when you're anxious, it isn't just awkward. Our source material for this deep dive reveals it's actually a surprising problem, especially professionally.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is how common that experience is and how we often misinterpret it. We think we're navigating discomfort gracefully, just by being polite.
Right, playing it safe.
Exactly. But the research we're diving into today, this comes from a social psychologist who spent, over 2 decades studying these uncomfortable social interactions. It paints a very different picture.
Absolutely. So this deep dive is going to take us through what this specific kind of anxious niceness actually looks like. We'll delve into why we default to it when the pressure's on.
And the costs, too.
Yes, expose its very real and often hidden costs.
Yeah.
And most importantly, share some concrete, research-backed steps we can take instead, all directly from this expert's work.
And, get ready, because some of the findings are quite eye-opening.
Yeah.
We'll be exploring everything from how your internal state, your anxiety, might physically impact someone else.
Wow. Okay.
To how trying to be nice can actually sort of hurt someone's career prospects.
So that initial feeling you have, that rush of anxiety in a potentially tricky interaction, the research explores it on multiple levels. There's what we say, the words we choose, how friendly we are, the compliments maybe. These are the most conscious things, I suppose.
Right. But the study goes deeper than that. It looks at the nonverbal behaviors, the things that are much harder to consciously control when you're uncomfortable.
Like fidgeting.
Yeah. Think fidgeting, subtle shifts in posture, changes in eye contact, maybe even, physically leaning away a little.
Yeah.
We might not even be fully aware we're doing them.
And then, maybe most revealingly, there's the under-the-skin responses.
Ah, yes, the physiological stuff.
Exactly. The research actually hooked people up to physiological monitors measuring heart rate, blood pressure, even stress hormones like cortisol during these awkward interactions, like giving difficult feedback or negotiating.
Yeah, these are the responses our bodies have with almost zero conscious control, really.
And what did they find?
Well, what they consistently found is a really rapid physiological response. Within mere seconds, literally seconds, of an interaction feeling uncomfortable or uncertain, those stress indicators just flare up.
So heart rate increases?
Heart rate up, palms might get sweaty, blood pressure rises. Only after that physiological wave hits does the conscious and non-conscious shift to niceness kick in.
Ah, okay.
That's when you get the generic pleasantries, the brittle smiles, the slight physical withdrawal.
So it's anxiety first, then the default to nice. And the research suggests this pattern is often triggered simply by lacking a clear script, right?
That seems to be a big part of it. We just don't know exactly what to say or do when the situation is ambiguous or, requires us to deliver potentially uncomfortable truths. So we retreat to what feels safe, being generally agreeable.
Is there a good example of this from the research?
Yeah, a great one comes from these negotiation studies they ran. Participants negotiated knowing one would win and one would lose. Afterwards, the winners were asked to give feedback to the losers on how they could improve next time.
Okay, makes sense. So what happened?
Well, instead of offering useful, actionable feedback, the winners, feeling perhaps a bit awkward or anxious about having won.
Yeah, that can be uncomfortable.
Right. They just piled on the generic compliments. They tell the losers how their ridiculously low opening offer was brilliant or how great it was that they didn't ask probing questions.
Which is obviously not helpful feedback.
Not at all. This is classic anxious niceness, using vague, positive language in a situation that really called for constructive criticism. It's that nonspecific, often effusive praise, particularly when it's delivered in a context of discomfort, that the author identifies as a hallmark of this pattern.
But the impact isn't just on the person giving the feedback feeling awkward. A significant part of this research explores the experience of being on the receiving end.
What's that like?
Yeah, what does it feel like to repeatedly interact with someone exhibiting these signs of anxious niceness? Like, the strained smile, the averted gaze, the subtle physical distance.
And this is where it gets really interesting and frankly quite important. The research highlights that the people most often on the receiving end of this kind of interaction, well, they tend to be racial minorities and members of other disadvantaged groups.
Why is that?
The author suggests this is often driven by the giver's anxiety, specifically anxiety about potentially appearing prejudiced.
Ah, okay, so they overcompensate.
They try to counteract that anxiety by being overly accommodating or, nice.
Wow. So the giver's anxiety about the social optics of the interaction leads to this specific kind of interaction pattern directed disproportionately at certain groups.
Exactly. And the impact goes much deeper than just receiving sort of unhelpful feedback. In studies measuring the physiological responses of both participants in cross-race interactions, they uncovered something pretty remarkable.
Which was?
That stress responses can actually be physiologically caught by the other person.
Caught. That's a powerful concept. You mean the receiver's body starts to mirror the giver's stress?
Precisely. They found that the more anxious the white participants appeared in the study, so the more they fidgeted, avoided eye contact, the higher their cortisol levels were. The more the black participants they were interacting with showed a correlated increase in their own physiological stress responses over time. Their bodies seemed to become physiologically linked up, in a way, by the interaction.
That's unsettling, because we generally think of our stress as purely internal, right?
We do.
But this suggests our bodies are much more socially interconnected than we realize. And prolonged exposure to someone else's unresolved anxiety, delivered as this anxious niceness, could have a real cumulative physiological toll on the receiver.
It raises a significant point about the hidden costs, absolutely. And beyond the potential physiological impact, there's a major professional cost.
Right, the feedback itself.
Exactly. Receiving only this over-the-top, positive, non-direct feedback harms performance because it completely lacks the information needed to improve. If all you ever get are generic compliments, how do you possibly know what specific behaviors you need to change or develop?
It actively hinders growth, and the damage isn't just confined to that immediate interaction, is it? The research shows it impacts reputations outside the conversation, too.
How so?
Well, if a manager only gives generic positive feedback about an employee, things like they're enthusiastic or a real team player,
Vague stuff.
super vague, that's the kind of feedback they'll then give to, say, a recruiter calling for a reference or maybe put in a letter of recommendation.
And what happens then? People reading that kind of vague praise usually assume one of two things. Either the person giving the feedback doesn't actually know the employee well enough to give specifics.
Or worse.
Or worse, they do have negative feedback, but are too uncomfortable or anxious to deliver it directly. So that nice but generic feedback actually ends up undermining the employee's credibility and potential opportunities.
Okay, so if this anxious niceness is the problem, the solution isn't to suddenly become blunt or mean. Right. The research is very clear on this.
Absolutely not. It's not about eliminating niceness, but transforming the way feedback is delivered.
How do we do that?
Exactly. The source material outlines several key strategies for moving forward. First, it suggests maybe assessing the existing culture. How much is this niceness culture really serving people? Often there's this layer of pluralistic ignorance. We think everyone loves it or that we have to participate in it. But actually, many people find generic feedback lazy, unhelpful, or even, frankly, a bit insulting.
Yeah, the source mentioned that example of the student getting just great job and clap emojis after weeks of complex work. That doesn't feel great.
No, it feels disengaged.
Yeah.
And simply asking, do you want me to be nice or honest, isn't helpful either. Most people will default to nice because it feels safer in the moment,
True. So what's the alternative?
The research proposes reframing the conversation around feedback itself.
Okay.
Yes. Instead of that nice versus honest binary, think about feedback along different dimensions. The source suggests two crucial ones, general versus specific, and keep doing, which is positive feedback, versus please stop, which is corrective feedback.
Right. We're often okay at general positive, your reports are timely. But, as we've discussed, that's not specific enough to be truly actionable. Does timely mean I always submit before the deadline or I respond to emails within 24 hours? specificity matters.
Hugely. And when it comes to the please stop feedback, the corrective kind, the source, really emphasizes it must be specific.
So not just, you need to show more initiative.
Exactly. That's a common unhelpful example. Most people have probably heard something vague like that.
Yeah.
But what does it even mean? The research says you have to break it down into observable behaviors.
Right.
Like, please stop waiting for explicit instructions on minor edits. If you spot a typo, just fix it. That's concrete.
And crucially, the source insists that if you are giving please stop feedback, you absolutely must pair it with specific do instead replacement behaviors.
Yes. Think of it like giving directions. If you tell someone, stop going north on this road, they're just lost, unless you tell them which road to take instead and in which direction.
Right. Otherwise, you're just pointing out a problem with no solution.
Precisely. Unless your goal is actually termination, you have to guide the person toward the correct or desired behavior. The memorable analogy from the source.
Uh-oh.
Is that without the do instead, it's like someone complaining about your performance in the bedroom without telling you what they'd like you to do instead.
Okay. That definitely drives the point home. But this sounds like a big shift, especially if anxious niceness is like deeply ingrained in a workplace culture. Where do you even start implementing this?
That's a fair point. The research suggests starting small and neutral. Focus on giving specific, actionable feedback that isn't necessarily positive or negative, just observant and helpful.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Things like, I would maybe switch the order of points 2 and 3 in your presentation, or let's try bolding the key terms on that slide for emphasis.
Ah, I see. Those are specific, they provide clear action, and they aren't emotionally charged at all.
Exactly. And what happens when people practice giving and receiving this kind of neutral, specific feedback? The research shows it actually reduces the anxiety around giving any feedback.
Really?
Yeah, even the more challenging, please stop kind. When people anticipate giving feedback that is useful and focused on observable behavior, those nonverbals we talked about, the fidgeting, the brittle smiles, they tend to decrease.
So building the muscle, basically.
You got it. The ultimate takeaway from this research isn't about discarding kindness. Niceness is incredibly valuable, right? But its proper place is in the delivery of direct, useful, specific feedback, not as a replacement for it.
Delivering clarity with care.
Beautifully put. The Force shares a personal anecdote about receiving critical feedback, but it was prefaced with genuine appreciation for what was working first.
Okay.
And that the specific behavior to correct was pointed out clearly. Something like, I really liked points 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
But you have a habit of looking up and to the right when you're concentrating, which could be a little distracting.
See, that specific observation, delivered within a framework of appreciation, feels manageable and actionable. It wasn't generic praise masking discomfort. It was clear guidance delivered kindly.
That's the goal. So, just to recap a bit, we've explored the manifestations of anxious niceness, the generic praise, the brittle smiles, the underlying physiological stress.
We've seen its roots in anxiety and that sort of lack of a clear social script for uncomfortable moments.
Right. And we've unpacked its significant, often hidden costs, hindering individual performance and growth, damaging reputations.
And potentially even transferring stress physiologically to those receiving it, particularly members of disadvantaged groups. That was a big one.
Huge. And the alternative, guided by this research, isn't about being harsh or mean. It's about intentionally shifting towards clear, specific, actionable feedback.
Which involves honestly assessing the existing cultural norms, reframing feedback away from that unhelpful nice versus honest binary.
Identifying specific please stop behaviors and always pairing them with crucial do instead replacement behaviors.
And building comfort by starting with low-stakes, neutral feedback first.
The core message really is that genuine niceness enables growth when it's coupled with clarity and specificity, rather than being used as a shield against our own discomfort. And remember, these dynamics aren't confined to professional settings. They play out in uncomfortable interactions everywhere we go.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, our listener. Considering that truly surprising finding that stress responses can be physiologically caught by others, how might recognizing your own discomfort in these moments and choosing the path of clearer, more specific communication, even if it feels awkward initially, how might that not only empower the other person to grow, but also potentially reduce the hidden physiological cost of the interaction for both of you? What stands out to you from this deep dive?